And Scott and David are leaving here on the 4th, so they'll be there shortly.
Oh, I know. It's in my calendar.
And what's your weather like?
It's absolutely beautiful. It's sunny, 81 degrees. However, we've been here for a month, and every day for the entire month it rains. But now that Judy and Elise have gotten here, it's fabulous.
Oh, I didn't know they were in charge of that.
Yes, of course.
Joe, are you doing the introduction to Elka?
No, Josh is going to introduce the program, but I first would like to thank you again, both of you, for agreeing to do this. This is in honor of LGBTQ History Month. And since we have a part of living history amongst us, I asked Eva if she would talk to us a little bit about her experience in the Mattachine Society, which for most of us is just something that we've read about, and Eva has lived it. So Josh, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joe. And thank you all for being here. Thank you especially to Eva for your time to spend this Sunday afternoon to talk about the Mattachine Society. We're very excited about this program, and that we planned this for LGBTQ History Month, I think, is for sure. And so I will stop talking and I will turn it over to Elka.
Thank you so much. And welcome, everybody. It's great to see you and to not see those of you who are listening, though. So that's wonderful. We are going to take you back about 60 years. Some of us were young and sprite then and maybe involved. Yeah, Jocelyn. And others were not quite there in age or in whatever. But Eva was. And I think you were in your mid-20s, Eva, and when you came to Washington.
Correct.
Will you tell us what it was like to be gay in Washington in those days?
Oh, to be gay in Washington in the early 60s was an interesting adventure because DC was still reeling from the McCarthy era. And in DC, the moral squad, it was a real squad of the DC Police Department, had a full-fledged entrapment campaign against homosexual men. And here's how it worked. A member of the squad would be stationed inside a public restroom, such as those in major department stores. Or they'd be stationed at the grounds of the Iwo Jima Memorial. And if two men appeared to be asking each other for a sexual encounter, now bear in mind they just had to appear to be asking each other for a sexual encounter, they would both be arrested. And homosexual men always expected to be beaten by the police if and when they were arrested. In addition, in DC, homosexuals were almost always discharged from federal and private employment, especially when they lost their security clearance. Homosexuals always received dishonorable discharges from the military. Homosexuals had immense difficulty securing decent housing, and two men or two women were not allowed to rent a studio or a one-bedroom apartment. Because that was reserved for heterosexual married couples.
Wow.
Homosexuals were thrown out of college when they were discovered, and this was also including the University of Maryland, where I was once a speaker. Police regularly raided homosexual bars. They would come in, flip on the lights, and demand to see ID from all the patrons. You can imagine what my response was when I was in a bar one night when this happened, and I just said, no, thank you.
Amazing you're still alive.
Yeah, well, I was a woman.
Oh, yeah, sorry, you didn't count.
I didn't beat women, at least not publicly. They just tried to bully us and scare us.
Was that the time also, Eva, I read somewhere that you had to prove that you were 3 pieces of clothing of your
Yes.
gender?
Yes, and this was especially for the women who ran around in drag. They
Uh-huh.
always counted how many pieces of female underwear they had, so that if the police picked them up and demanded anything, they could demonstrate. It was illegal for couples of the same sex to dance in the bars, and any and all premarital activity was indeed illegal in DC. And that's basically what DC was like in the early 60s.
So it sounds like quite a fearful time.
It was pretty ugly, I've got to tell you.
So how did the Mattachine Society come about?
The Mattachine Society came about just because Frank Kameny had graduated from Harvard with a PhD in astronomy, and he was hired to work for the federal government. This was after he got out of the military with an honorable discharge. So he was hired to work, and then about a year later, they just found out that he was a homosexual, and he was fired, lost his clearance. And of course, without a clearance, he was unable to secure another job. He never had a real job again. Now, Frank was familiar with the Mattachine of San Francisco and the Mattachine Society of New York, but he thought these were inconsequential to his needs. And he wanted a more activist organization. And so he began the Mattachine Society of Washington with the idea that it would be an activist organization and not one of these do nothing social have a party organizations.
Well, that's good too, to have a party every now and then, but Mattachine in DC focused on activism, you said. So what did they do?
They had a number of major activities. They had an information and education campaign where they distributed wallet-sized cards with the Mattachine phone number, and they had a newsletter called The Insider. That was a 1 to 2 page format to be distributed to the LGBT community, containing information about where to go for assistance and what police were not allowed to do if they arrested you. They did public speaking on radio, TV, and college classrooms. Another activity were picket lines. So Mattachine had picket lines periodically at the Pentagon, the White House, and even the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia.
Oh yeah, I remember I saw you once in a video clip of those days. I think that was the only time I've ever seen you in a skirt. You were all really prim and proper, right?
Yeah, that was probably the only time I was in a skirt in public.
And this was why? I know there was something behind it.
Yeah, obviously, because Frank had the brilliant idea that people would accept homosexuals if they saw that homosexuals were just like them. And so to be eligible to be on the picket line, Frank demanded that the men had jackets and ties and that the women were in skirts or dresses. And he said heels, and on that the women rebelled. We would do skirts of some type, but we absolutely were not going to do a picket line in heels. That was just too ridiculous. A number of other things that Mattachine did. Somebody in Mattachine presented to Frank the slogan, "Gay is good," that Frank thought was wonderful and had buttons printed up. And that slogan appeared on signs on the picket lines. And later on, the slogan "Gay Pride" was picked up as a tool of political resistance.
Mm-hmm.
Mattachine and Frank defended individuals who were about to be terminated from federal employment and or from the military. Because according to the rules, a person who was doing defending did not have to be a lawyer. And so Frank, in all his glorious brilliance, totally memorized all the rules and regulations from both the Civil Service Commission and DOD, and went in there to defend people who had asked him to be their defender. And I had the experience to be with him on just one of these events, and I was just blown away that the CSC, the civil service person or the DOD person, whichever it happened to be, would say something and say, well, this person deserves to be terminated because, and Frank would look at them and in his very brusque and aggressive voice, which he always had, would say, no, you're wrong, because, and they would say, I'm wrong. And he would say, yep, you're wrong. And then
Look
he
it
would
up.
continue with his speech. The next thing that Frank did and Mattachine did was to initiate an action against the American Psychological Association because they labeled homosexuals as sick. And Frank finally understood one day that no matter if the rules changed or the regulations changed or the people changed, whether in the organization or in Congress, it didn't matter because the APA said these folks were sick. And that would always be something that hung over our heads and hung over.
I think it was, oh, sorry to interrupt you. Wasn't it something like 1978 or so until APA changed that and took that out of the book?
Stuart, you're shaking your head no.
Oh, Stuart, you're muted.
American Psychiatric Association, not American Psychological.
Sorry, okay.
That's okay. And it was 1973
Oh, really?
when it changed. Yes, and Frank and Barbara Giddings accompanied John Fryer, the gay psychiatrist who was Dr. Anonymous, when he testified before the diagnostic committee about being a closeted gay psychiatrist and the risk that we all had then to our professional careers. And so he played an important role in that as well.
Thank you, Stuart. Yeah. So 73, that was earlier than I thought. Thanks. And so do you have some other timelines for us, Eva, regarding what the Mattachine Society of Washington did?
Yeah, they filed papers to become a formal civil rights organization in 1961. In 62, they developed their media strategy. In 64, Frank testified before the House committees. In 65 was the first picket at the White House, followed by a picket at the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. In 66, Frank defended a civilian who was being dismissed by the federal government for being a homosexual. There was another picket in 68. In 69, the Insider, the news organ, was designed to be an organizing tool, first contained the mention of violence. Up until this point,
Wait. The violence of the police or what?
No, the violence necessary to create change for the homosexual.
Okay.
And I must admit, in all honesty, that I was one of the co-editors of that organ. And the article that talked about the use of violence was one of my articles. Because I began to see, and I was really following the Black Panthers at that point, and I knew the Black Panthers handed out a newspaper on the streets as a community organizing tool to let folks know what they were doing. And so I thought Mattachine should do the same thing. And Richard and I put together the Insider. And it was amazing to us when we went to distribute it in the bars. The managers of the bars, the bartenders, the security people in the bars did not want us distributing this paper. They thought it would bring the police down on them, that they would lose their license, and they threw us out. It was take your damn papers and get out of here. And so I said to Richard, no, there's one place they're not going to look, and we'll just slide inside. We'll put these in our backpacks so they don't see them, and we'll go to the next bar. And we did. We left the stacks in the bathrooms.
Yeah, that's a safe place, so to speak.
That's what we thought. So that's what we did.
And you came to the opinion that violence was necessary because being nice didn't get you anywhere, or what?
That's it. And Frank never agreed to that. That was something that we put into the newspaper. We never asked permission to put it in. Frank never caught it because he never read it, because he knew everything. I mean, why should he read his own material?
Well, did you get reaction from the other members who actually did read it?
I don't recall any reaction or much reaction. Certainly nobody said, don't do it. I would suspect a few people said, well, that's not a good thing.
Do you recall how many members the Mattachine Society actually had at that point?
That was
DC?
I think about 30 or 40.
Okay.
I mean, there were some who, like any organization, there were some who came to meetings on a regular basis. There were others who never came to meetings. There were others who came sometimes, and there were those who gave money and who were not members. I mean,
yeah, like everywhere, like you said.
right.
And then you also began to see a shift, is that right? In the late 60s, around 69, 70?
Yeah. Mattachine was closing in on its desire to create change. For example, by that time, DC Police Department entrapment was significantly reduced in 70, and then in the early 70s, the Civil Service Commission caved into Frank's argument that sexual habits, believe it or not, had no relationship to job performance or to vulnerability to blackmail if one was out. And this was a big case with the Civil Service Commission, a court case of Norton versus Macy. Macy was the head of the Civil Service Commission at that time. Then I think it was in 73, APA formally changed its categories and removed
Stuart talked about that.
From the list of mental disorders, thus facilitating the ability of homosexuals to gain and hold security clearances at all levels. And then in 75, changes were made to the civil service regulations. And it was not until 2009 that the Office of Personnel Management, which formally apologized to Frank for throwing him out of his job and making sure, and thus ensuring that he was never going to work as an astronomer or a scientist again.
And that was about 2 generations later. Wow,
Right.
that is amazing.
So the active
talking- sorry.
Mattachine Society of Washington actually ran through 10 years. After that, Mattachine kind of dwindled off as an ongoing organization, and it was replaced in DC, also following New York's lead. It was followed by different organizations, including the Gay Activist Alliance, which was another activist organization, and the Gay Liberation Front, which was very much a street-oriented organization for change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you said
then
that
there
at that
became-
point,
What, Elka?
I said, you had told me that at that point, people, I mean, gay males were also done with wearing jackets, and women were not going to step back into
Right,
wearing skirts to be nice.
The last 1 or 2 picket lines, a busload of folks came down from New York. And these were the folks who, and Frank said, "You can't be on my picket line." And they said, "Why not?" And Frank said, "Because you're not wearing a jacket and tie, and your women are not in skirts." And they said, "Well, we believe in your cause, Frank, so we're going on this picket line." And they did. They had their own picket signs with them, and off they went into the picket line. They interspersed themselves among all the nice folks from DC. And then we saw that it was possible to stand up to Frank, because before that, nobody would ever really stand up to him. I mean, at a meeting, we might say, "Frank, that's not a good idea." And Frank would say, "Well, that's what we're doing." And they also,
So basically, Mattachine, Washington was Frank.
yeah, basically.
Mm-hmm. I think you had said earlier, Eva, that he never got or took another job, proper
Right.
job again. So what did he do? I know he was very active throughout his life.
Yeah, he never had another job. He did, however, continue working on discrimination cases. And it was under the banner of Mattachine that he continued to work on homosexual and lesbian discrimination cases. He solicited cases by making it known in the community that he could help. He then represented the homosexuals and lesbians before the military, the Civil Service Commission, and the Department of Defense. He represented those losing their clearances and those losing their jobs.
That's remarkable that he was able to make a career out of that.
Well, he did. He did not. He relied on people supporting him. So there were people who brought him food, other people who donated clothes to him,
Oh.
Other people who took him out to dinner. There was one person who realized that Frank's teeth really needed dental assistance and took him to their dentist and paid the bill for that. And Frank, sometimes his food intake dwindled down to 2 bowls of cereal a day. I mean, he was like living on starving student accommodations. The house he was living in, that was an interesting story. He lived up in one of the best sections of DC. And he was there because at first when he was working, he rented it. And then he had no money to rent it. So he talked to his landlady. And if he brought to her a bottle of liquor that she liked and brought her enough to keep her drinking for the week, then she let him be in the house, let him stay in the house without paying rent. So that's what he did for years. Once a week, he would march over to her place with a bottle of liquor or 2 bottles of liquor, I don't know. And he was good for the month. And this is what he did month after month after month.
So he did stay a real community person.
Yes,
And
he
then
did.
he, like you said, he survived, but he didn't exactly make a glorious
Right.
career out of it. Oh, there's
Right.
a question in the chat room. Do you want to take them later or do you want to hear it now?
I think I'd rather do it after we're finished with the prepared questions.
Okay. Okay, so then let me ask you, we'll come back to this then. Well, let me ask you, what you learned from Frank and the Mattachine Society, and how you applied it later when
Yeah.
Mattachine was not of much importance anymore.
I learned 1, 2, 3, 4 important things that I then utilized in my life. 1, I learned to beat an organization by using their own rules. I learned that bullies are really terrified of having their bluff called. I learned that I had a lot to learn from experts, and that I learned that I am worthy and that I have to act like I have worth. So you asked how I applied these lessons to other parts of my life.
Mm-hmm.
So here are a couple of examples. 1, I had a boss who threatened to fire me. I told him I did not need his job and he could do whatever he needed to do. He just looked at me. He did not fire me, and from then on pestered me with questions about why did I not need income from this job. Of course, I ignored his questions. On another occasion, I had a party at my apartment, and I invited some of my lesbian friends, some of whom actually lived in drag. I also invited my male friends from my Naval Reserve unit. A week later, I received an anonymous phone call threatening to turn me in to the Navy Department. I recognized the voice as one of the Naval Reserve guys and told him if he did, I would point out to his superiors, because he worked for the Department of Navy and the unit that investigated homosexuals. I would point out to his superiors that he was at my party and that he was just really annoyed that he could not hit on one of the feminine lesbians. That was the end of that series of phone calls. Then at some point, I was working for the Securities Exchange Commission. And one day I came back from lunch and was told that the director of personnel would be calling me that afternoon because I had been seen kissing another woman who was a friend of mine and whom I had just met for lunch. I stormed up the stairs right into his office, past the secretary who was yelling, "You can't go in there," and into his office and told him that if he called me up to fire me, I would have a Washington Post reporter with me. And I was absolutely positive he did not want to explain that story to his boss, especially since he was so close to retirement. I was not called up and no one ever bothered me. So that were a couple of examples of how I used Frank's lessons in my own personal life. For those of you who are interested in the interested in the details of the names and dates and places of some of the events I have mentioned, I refer you to 2 specific books that I have here that I will hold up to the camera. Can you see this, Elka?
No, you have to hold it. Yeah, there.
Ah, okay.
I don't know if
This is the
People can
Devious
see it.
War.
It's called The Deviant's War by Eric,
Yep.
no?
Eric, yeah, by Eric Savant.
Servini.
So this is one, and I was interviewed for that book. And here's another one.
That's hard to hold up because it's so heavy.
Yeah,
That is The Gay Revolution by Lillian Federman, renowned
was
lesbian
interviewed.
historian.
yeah, I was interviewed for this one. And the other one was Secret City by James Kerchak, which I do not have a copy of, and for which I was also interviewed. So my name appears a number of times in each of those three books.
It's because you live so long.
Yeah, well, I tell people that I'm older than dirt. And some of
But
them
you are one of
believe
only
me.
2 surviving members of the Mattachine at this point. So I think
Well, I
that's
may
pointing
be
out.
one. I'm not sure. I wrote to Paul Kunzler because I had hoped he would join us because he was such a wealth of dates and names and details.
Mhm.
But I haven't heard from him, and that was several months ago that I wrote to him. And Joe tried to contact him also with no success. So either he has moved out of the city, or he has died, or he is sick someplace. So on that note, I guess that I'm the last functioning survivor of the Mattachine Society of Washington.
Well, we are glad you are. And we thank you for all this. And Josh, are you going to go to the questions that have come up in the chat?
Sure, I can read a few of the questions. So we had one from Mindy asking Eva if you can let us know where you were working during these early years.
Where I was working, Mindy?
Yes. What
Oh,
you did during those years?
during these years. I'm trying to think. I was working, I worked for the Securities and Exchange Commission for 5 years. For some of the time, I was in graduate school at GW. And before the Securities and Exchange Commission here in Washington, I was working for the National Education Association, who kind of made me sick to the stomach with their very open racism, which I realized when I was down in the lobby one day and I was looking at the bulletin board where they posted the events of the different chapters. And I noticed that there was one bulletin board for white chapters and one bulletin board for Black chapters. So
Wow.
with that, a few months later, I quit. So I was only at NEA for about a year. Then when I was at the Securities and Exchange Commission, I realized because I was an analyst, and so I had to periodically go down to the basement to the file room to pull these huge dockets of paperwork that companies had to file with the SEC. And one day I was down there and I was talking to one of the guys who worked there. And he mentioned to me that he had a degree in accounting. And then he pointed to one of the other guys, all of whom were Black, and said he has a degree in accounting and he has a degree in finance and he has a degree in finance and so on. And I knew my boss had been asking his staff, all of us, if we knew any accountants or financial analysts, because he needed to enlarge his staff. So, of course, being the naive person that I was, with my stack of dockets, marched up the elevator, back into my office, and said to my boss, "Are you still looking for accountant types?" And he said, "Yes, do you know one?" I said, "I know 20. And he said, "You know 20? I said, "Yeah, they're all working downstairs in the file room." He said, "I can't hire them." I said, "Why not? The SEC has already hired them." He said, "They're black. They can't work here." So within a month, I was gone from the SEC. I guess having patience was not one of the things I learned in Mattachine.
Or ever.
Or, right.
We also
I
have
want
another
it done right now.
We have another question from Joe Pomper. He asks, what caused the society to become less relevant?
What caused the Mattachine Society to become less relevant? Because the society at large was changing and was in the process. It was the beginning of Black liberation. On a very serious note, it was the beginning of women's liberation. It was the time when the Gay Liberation Front was doing its street theater. It was just a time of social unrest. It was the time of the Peace Corps coming home. And can you imagine these kids who had spent 4 years in some quiet country coming back to social revolution in this country? They just totally flipped out, and the government had to have a program to transition them back to the US. And I know that because I was part of the consulting company that did that training. Does that answer your question, Joe? You're on mute.
Yes, thanks, Eva. I was curious, because it had been such an important organization and then it just sort of faded away. But I understand now that it was not keeping up with societal changes. So thank you for that insight.
Right.
I would also like to add, I don't know if it's relevant, but at the end of the 60s, a lot of focus had changed to anti-war activities because of Vietnam.
That's
And,
true.
the student activities in that regard led
Right.
to more and more open feminist activities, leading us into the 70s and the women's movement, no?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I would invite, if anyone who is not putting questions in the chat, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand.
There are a couple actually,
invite
Josh.
them.
So DB posted a question in the chat. Do you see that?
Yep, I'm just saying if anyone else has not posted in the chat,
Oh,
you can
sorry.
just raise your hand.
Sorry.
And so yes, DB has asked, do you think the US would have had same-sex marriage much earlier if we didn't experience the AIDS crisis?
Wow, that's a hard one. I don't think so. I think those were really two unrelated issues. I mean, one of the things, what the AIDS crisis did that I saw was that it pulled the community together in a way that nothing else had. On the flip side of that learning was I saw the women flocking to be supportive of the men's community, both as caretakers and doing a lot of the emotional work. And then I just totally exploded when I realized that the men were not coming to support the women's community regarding the cancer work and the breast cancer problems and the issues that the women were dealing with, also physical issues. And I remember one night at Mishpachah, they were having an AIDS program. This was a very long time ago. And at the end, I stood up and I asked how many of the men there were using safe sex. And not that many hands went up. And I just went on a rampage of verbal abuse and told them, do not ever ask me to be supportive of you when you get sick. Do not ever have the nerve to do that. So I was not well liked for a long time after that. But I was respected, which is what I guess I have always striven for.
We have a question from Paula or Deb, or maybe both. Deb.
You need to unmute.
To your question, DB, I think that the fact that same-sex marriage got into the conversation was the situation where many gay couples, when they were in the hospital, the partner of the ill partner had no recourse. So they had to get lawyers to write different powers of attorney, powers of medical attorney, which heterosexual couples didn't have to do, because by virtue of being married, they had the opportunity to be the advocate for their spouse. So if the AIDS epidemic hadn't happened, I don't think it would have accelerated it to the point where it did. I think that it would have probably taken maybe even longer, by virtue of the fact that we were visiting our partners, they were visiting the partners in the hospitals.
That's a good point, Deb. And I'd like to add to that. For instance, I know there was one hospital in Baltimore that even though the person had the medical power of attorney, in their hand said, no, you can't go in.
Oh, well, that's interesting. Well, what I asked the question I was thinking about, excuse me, I'm on my iPhone, so I'm still trying to figure out how to, it's been quite a while, but I remember reading the book And the Band Played On. And I was born in 77, so I didn't experience this history, but I was told the height of the LGBT movement was in the late 70s, and that it was very strong. And then somehow I took away from that, it all unraveled when people started dying in droves. And so that's where I had the thought that there would have been progress earlier. But what I'm hearing you say is, in fact, the crisis is what drove equality of marriage.
Stuart.
Yes, thank you. Just on this last issue, and I want to raise something else with Eva, but I think Deb is correct, but it wasn't only about the visitation in hospital, it was all the aspects of the AIDS epidemic that drew attention to the very large gay community in the country, that for that, there were 20 or 30 people marching in the Mattachine Society. So I think it was overcome by the numbers of people who were outed and came out, and that people realized in some sense, like Frank Kameny had said earlier on, that, we were all through society and we were just like everybody else in many ways. That people realized there were gay and lesbian couples that were living together for decades, and all of the rest of that put an end to some of the stereotypes that had justified discrimination earlier. It took many, many years, and it's still not all gone. I understand that. I just wanted to mention, Eva, that the documentary film that Elka mentioned, She Saw You in a Skirt, was, which I saw also, is called Cured. It was on PBS several years ago, and it's also made the rounds of the documentary film festivals in the country. And maybe those who haven't seen it might look for it, because it's really quite wonderful. And I think there are several segments that you appear in. I guess The other thing was that in the early 60s, when this was going on, wasn't there an intersection between the gay rights movement and the Black rights movement? And for example, in 63, with the big civil rights march, where Bayard Rustin was the chief organizer, he got pushed aside because he was openly gay, could not be blackmailed because he was open and always been open, and but also that the civil rights movement leadership was very concerned that they would be tainted with with this association with gays and lesbians. What do you think about that and the intersection between these different movements?
I did not see an intersection. I was not involved in any way in an intersection, I must admit.
Are you
But
saying that Mattachine was all white in Washington?
yes,
Mhm.
And what about the intersection with the women's liberation movement?
the only thing that the women's movement and Mattachine did, or no, it wasn't. It wasn't Mattachine. Was getting the DC human rights legislation passed, and that was done with a giant coalition of groups. Mattachine and the Gay Activist Alliance and the Gay Liberation Front, the National Organizations for Women's DC chapter, a number of the university student organizations, and I forget the name of it, the Organization for Women Who Were on Welfare, all joined together kind of informally in a gigando coalition to get the DC City Council to pass all-encompassing human rights legislation so that the women on welfare would no longer be denied decent housing because they only had welfare checks to pay the rent. The student groups wanted access to off-campus housing, which they weren't getting because they were students. The women's movement wanted access to financial stuff without having a male signature. Things like checking accounts and credit cards and rental agreements and mortgages, a few odd things like that that nobody ever cares about, right? And so we did that. Now, not all of them were willing to speak or could speak to before the DC City Council, but I was willing to do that under the umbrella of the National Organization for Women. And so I wrote my speech, and at that time I was living in a house with a heterosexual couple, one of whom happened to be a lawyer. And he was very tuned into the civil rights stuff. And I said, Charlie, I need you to read this just for correctness. Don't tell me how to write it. Don't tell me how it would be better if I did something else. Just make sure what I'm saying is correct and thread it together correctly. And so he said, okay. And he did, and he handed it back to me. And I said, well, and he said, I have no changes. And I said, Charlie, you've never had no changes. He said, I have no changes because this is great. He said, I would like to use this in one of my articles. So I think he did at some point, I don't know. But anyhow, I went and I testified in front of the DC City Council at the time. And that there were 2 hearings because that's required by law in DC. and I was interviewed on television. And so what between the two hearings where they were going to vote, that's where the other side took over. For instance, the students and the Gay Activist Alliance, the Gay Liberation Front had bodies. And so they did sit-ins in the offices of the council members from the different districts of DC and all kinds of other stuff to keep the attention on this bill. And the bill finally did pass. It passed as Title 34. Stuart, that's for your history piece. It was not until later that it became the Human Rights Act.
Do you recall which year that was, Eva, that you testified and all this?
Oh.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah. It was in the early 70s. 73, no, the mid 70s, because I joined, I was in DC now in 1973. And it was in 73, 72 or 73 that National Now okayed having a gay and lesbian task force. It was not called the Gay and Lesbian Task Force, it was called the Sexuality Task Force. And as soon as National Now had one, I knew I could go to DC Now and say, look, they've got one nationally, we need to have one here. So they said, okay, the board said, okay. And there was a sexuality task force in DC, which coincidentally I became co-chair of. And it was under that umbrella that I did the work with the coalition to get Title 34 passed.
Great. We do have another question in the chat. Can you talk about the violence the society encouraged folks to engage in?
Well, it was just one time in the newsletter and there was never any violence as a result.
Thank you. And I see Joel Martin has his hand raised.
Eva, it's Joel Martin. Hugs and kisses. I just wanted to say that
no, Joe Pomper has his hand raised.
Well, let Joe Martin finish.
Frank Kameny used to come to GLF meetings and speak up, and he was too dogmatic and too structured, and he would basically be ignored after a certain period of time. I can't say exactly when, but he was ignored. He was respected. And then, of course, afterwards, we had the Kameny campaign, which was certainly very, very, very successful. And we then had the GAA because GAA from New York came to Washington to support the Kameny campaign. Once again, a successful organization. And about gay marriage, I would say that the Quilt and ACT UP are the main things that changed the way America thinks about gay and lesbian, well, LGBTQI, whoever and ever people in this country. The quilt is monumental. The quilt on the mall was monumental.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've never seen that, it will drive you to tears because I'm ready now. It's just monumental. And the fact that Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton came out and looked at it or whatever, that's very important. And
oh, thank you so much. I had that, all of that had slipped out of my brain.
That's okay. It happens to all of us when we get old. I'm used to it all the time. But
and it's good seeing you again, Joel.
Same. And same to Jocelyn and other people that I know.
Joe? Oh, you're muted, Joe.
Joe, you're
Story of my
muted.
life. Yes, I'm muted now. Eva, sort of piggybacking a little bit onto what Joel was saying, from what you said, I read Secret City, and what they were talking about, Frank's role in the Mattachine Society and sort of getting it up and running and so on and so forth. That he was the driving force. What was he like as a person? I mean, you're somebody who knew him.
As a person, Frank was arrogant, aggressive, verbally aggressive.
Yeah. He really knew how to piss people off.
Yes. I never quite got that part down right.
Deb or
Don't
Paula?
misunderstand. We all respected him because he's the original, well, maybe not the original because there were people in the West Coast, but he's one of the original fighters of this cause and basically maybe the father of this movement as it is and still remains.
I met him a few times, Joe, and clearly he was respected. You could feel that in the room, but he was never, as far as I could tell, warm and cuddly, and he certainly didn't beat around the bush. And when he realized that Eva and I were a couple, he said to me, "You picked a good one." He was right on that.
Okay, we'll go to Paula and then Mindy.
So I have two questions. The second one may be a yes or a no, but the first one is, when you started picketing, did you have people coming and protesting, or I mean, what did your picket signs say? Did they know what your cause was? And didn't you get harassment from just general people on the street, if not the police?
The police were very good and were there to protect us from any harassment or for any counter stuff. There were never any counter demonstrations. I guess if we weren't considered important enough.
Oh, wow.
And what the sign said was gay is good and homosexuals are the same. I mean, a number of things I don't recall.
But you couldn't go to the bars without being arrested.
Well, I was never arrested.
Okay.
And I never saw any of the women dragged out. I think the police in the gay bar, in the women's bar at least, was just for harassment purposes.
Okay. So my second quick question is, were you always as tenacious as you are before you came to Washington, D.C.?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Because in school, I was a good kid and did what I was supposed to. Except occasionally. I remember when I was in high school, and I was the only one ever to flunk home ec in my high school. And I came home and I said to my parents that I had flunked home ec. I don't want to take it over again. And I won't take it over again. And so my father looked up very quietly and said, "Well, what do you want to take instead?" I said, "Shop." And he said, "Then why don't you?" And I said, "Because they told me only boys are allowed in shop." And my father said, "I'll go to school with you tomorrow and we'll talk to the principal. And I will explain that you know more about tools." That's right. My father was an electrician and I worked with him as an apprentice electrician. So I knew all the hand tools. I knew some of the bigger machines. And so he went with me to the principal's office and we talked, they talked, I listened. And the principal said, "Go down and talk to the shop teacher. If he says okay, then I'll say okay." So my father said, "Where's the shop?" And I took him down there. And class was in session, so I went in and very quietly asked him to step out. And he and my father had a talk. I was standing right there. And my father explained to him that I knew all the hand tools and that I already had worked with these hand tools. And I just wanted to be in the shop class. And he finally said yes.
Wow. So you were an activist when you were
Yeah.
younger.
So then we marched back upstairs and the principal signed off on the piece of paper. And the next day I was in the shop class. I was such a happy camper.
I didn't think about that, getting my father involved with that same situation for
Her
me.
father was a shop teacher.
Okay, so you are, so you had it.
Wait,
You have
what
it
was
in your
that,
genes.
Paul?
My dad was a shop teacher. I hated
Home ec.
home ec also. I did really poorly, but I didn't think about asking him to go
To
into school
advocate.
and advocate. So you were tenacious. Thank you.
And actually, Eva answered my question. I was going to ask about when and where and why does she think she became an activist, but I think she just sort of answered it a little bit. So,
Well, I think my first introduction to activism was really part of a job. I quit graduate school at GW because I knew I was going to flunk the exams at the end of the year because I test very poorly. And the next week they were going to start exams. And I thought, I can't do this. I can't do this. So I walked in and said, I quit. I'm out of here. So there I was. I had taken all the classes for my master's and just never took the final exam at GW. And I got a job in Reading, Pennsylvania, which I've learned was a very Republican town, very conservative, and the capital of the county, the big city in the county. So I went up and I became part of the Model Cities program, which I then learned was part of the period of change in the US government, giving money to communities so that they can improve themselves. And so one day I was sitting in my office after hours, and one of the young staff people came in and said, Eva, I'd like you to meet a friend of mine who needs your help. And I turned around and there were these two young Black guys, and they were introduced as members of the Reading Black Panther Party. I didn't even know there was a Black Panther Party in Reading. And so I sat down and I chatted with them and I said, what can I help you with, guys? And they said, we're having problems figuring out what we're doing. So I gave them the mini lecture that I had given to one of the NOW chapters months before about strategic planning, because that was what I did, as I ran sessions in strategic planning. So I gave them a mini lecture and they were so excited they could hardly cope. And they said, okay, Eva, from now on, you're safe in our section of Reading. And that was the big Black neighborhood. He said, you can walk there at any hour of the day or night and no one will bother you. I tell you, no one. And I thought, how nice is this? So I thanked them very much. I told them to come back anytime. And because the Model Cities program was focused on a different neighborhood. And the different neighborhood was the white neighborhood consisting of Polish and Greek and some German, but mostly from the Polish side. Elka, what's down in that area? Okay. At any rate, that's the part that the Model Cities program was in. So one day, one of my staff people, who was in the lower ranking staff group, comes to me and says, Eva, I'd like to take you to dinner tonight. You can call it a business dinner. I think that's what you Washington people call it, a business dinner. I said, okay, Ken, you're on. So we went down into the Marl Cities neighborhood at one of the nicer restaurants. And he paid for it. He took out this wad of money. And my eyes just got bigger and bigger. And he looked at me, he said, the only reason I work for you at the Model Cities office is because I need to have a source of legal income for the IRS. I said, I'm not going to ask. I don't want to know. He said, that's great. He said, we'll get along fine. He said, I just want you to understand that Reading is not as safe as it used to be because your guys came in and took out all of our big mafia guys. Apparently, Reading used to be a hotspot for the high-ranking mafia people, especially in the summertime. And so the FBI took them all out and put them in prison in a big sweep of mafia in the United States. And so, as Ken said to me, what that did was leave the very low-level mafia in place. And he said they're so stupid. They're here because they weren't smart enough to become big guys. And so we're living with that. We really don't like them very much, but we're stuck with them. So then after dinner, we went down to one of his favorite bar. The bar is where all the pool tables were. And he said, I'm going to teach you how to shoot pool. So he did, sort of. We were down there for a couple of nights as Ken taught me how to shoot pool and how to sort of control the ball and how to mostly send the ball where I wanted it. And then one night we were in there and he took me over to the bar itself. Because up to this point, I was only allowed at the pool table. And he took me to the bar and he said to the bartender, he said, I want you to meet my boss, Eva. She's going to be in here by herself. I want you to make sure that nobody bothers her. And he said, okay, Kenny, whatever you say. So the next night I was there all by myself. And a couple of guys came over from their tables and wanted to shoot pool with me. And all of a sudden I hear this voice coming from the bar that says, go back to your table. And the guys turn around and they go, yes. And back to the table they went. And the next night after that, I came in again and I was at the table and some different guy came up and wanted to challenge me to a game of pool. And a booming voice tells him to go back to his table. And after that, nobody came up, not even to say hello. And then one night, Ken shows up and he said, how's it going to me? And I said, it's great. I'm learning how to do what you taught me to do. I still don't do it really well. And he walked to the bartender and said, well, he said, a couple guys came up the first 2 nights. She's good after that. And he said, okay, that's all I need to know. And then he said to me, you can walk any place in the Model Cities and you're okay. So now I had 2 neighborhoods I could walk around in. And I did periodically. So that's my story of where my activism started. It actually started with a paid job, which sounds a little oxymoronic, but that's how it is.
We have maybe time for one more question from the group, but I do want to ask this one that's in the chat. It says, did Harry Hay have any influence on the DC chapter?
Wait, say that again, Josh.
Did Harry Hay have any influence on the DC chapter?
Except, well, Frank knew that Harry Hay did what he did in California, but I would say no influence, except to do something different.
All right, Stuart, I will give you the last question.
Okay, I just wanted to ask Eva if you could say something about how your early activist experience influenced your joining in Beit Mishpachah and what that early experience was like as a lesbian activist.
That's a whole book, Stuart. I mean, really. No, actually, the activism had nothing to do with joining Bet Mish. I came to Bet Mish because at that point in my life, I felt I had no roots. I had recently broken up with a long-term relationship. I was estranged for various reasons from many members of my family. I did not want to go back home again. It was just one of those points in life.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew about Bet Mish, and I stumbled in one Friday night, and I thought, oh, maybe. And then I stumbled in again the next week, and I thought maybe, and then that was when Bet Mish was over in Southwest, and we did Tashlik in the fountain because it was moving water. And that worked out because around that time I was working in the Annapolis area, and I could come home and drive straight to Bet Mish and use that as my kind of transition back to my other life. And that's how I wound up at Bet Mish, and then the rest is history.
Thanks.
Scott, I see you laughing a lot. Is that my imagination or what? No answer from Scott. Okay.
No, he posted something in the chat, Eva. It just said, so glad you stumbled in, Eva.
Oh, I didn't hear
Oh.
you. I didn't hear you said my name. No, thank you so much for this. You know, I just think back to, I think the thing that stands out in my head in my early days at Bet Mish is when you would get up to give a drosh. And we would all be like, what's she gonna say? And it always hit home, hit somewhere, that's for sure.
Thank you so much, Scott.
Well, thank you so much, Eva, for
Thanks,
this
Eva.
wonderful presentation. Thank you, Elka, for moderating and asking questions. It's so important for us to tell these stories and to share these stories out loud. And so if you all are okay with it, I would love to share this on our website and also on our social media, just because I think people need to hear these stories.
I want to say thank you to my sisters who are here with us on Zoom, and to say hello to Devora, who's here from Canada.
Wow. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Before we
I
leave,
think we met Devore. Didn't you go to the Capitol Museum exhibit with the deli exhibit, right, with Scott?
Yes,
Yeah, we did meet.
yes.
Nice to
I
see you
thought so.
again.
When you
And
said
Joe,
Canada,
too. Yeah, Joe too.
may I ask a question of Joel? Joel, would you be comfortable introducing yourself to, we have 20 folks here and more than 80% Betmish members. There are some members who may not know of you, and I was wondering if you could just take less than a minute just to introduce yourself and let us and share with us your involvement with Mishpachah, since it is our 50th anniversary year.
Well, I don't know what to say except Bet Mishpachah was a concept that came out of an ad, I think in the Blade maybe, of 3 people that got together who were Jewish, who thought there should be a Jewish organization. It is after GAA was formed, because I was president of GAA. I was one of the founders of GAA, and then I was the first president. And then I sort of stepped back a bit, and then I saw that ad and we got together, and that's how we started. And I don't know, I never really thought what it was to be. I remember maybe 25, 30 years ago, someone told me that 300 people showed up for services, and I was just blown away. I cried because that was not, I never thought that it could be that big. I never thought it could be that satisfying. It could be that evolved into the community. I still am just in awe of it. I think it's wonderful. I've been an activist for all of my life. I marched against the war in Vietnam in 1964. My mother marched with me at every women's march here in Washington. You know, I've been to every gay march in Washington. I still support all kinds of progressive causes. I am in a wonderment of Bet Mishpachah. It's a great thing. You know, it's a great thing. It's something that we all needed. We have it. We should cherish it. And I'm so humbled to have been there at the start.
Bravo.
And you held the first Havara in your home. Is that correct, Joel?
Yes. It was at 13. Well, the first High Holy Day services were 1353 Mass Avenue Southeast. I bought that property in 1971, and I just sold it 3-4 years ago after owning it for 50 years.
Wow.
Always lived in DC.
How many people came to that High Holy Day service at your house?
I think somewhere about 15, maybe 20.
And what Maksur did you read? And what was it, the conservative?
I'm not, I really have no remembrance of that. I don't know whether Neff was involved at that point.
No,
I was, but
Larry came in 1977.
Oh, okay. So Larry Neff wasn't involved. So I don't know. You know, Marty Shate, maybe of Baltimore, may have been the person that led that service.
Yes, and I think, and he brought a bunch of conservative mobsters from Baltimore to
There was a guy, Robert Crystal. There were about 6 or 8 people from Baltimore that used to come. They were pissed off at us in Washington because we never went to Baltimore. You know, it's the way all gay organizations were. You know, everybody fought GLF, everybody fought at GAA, everybody fought in the beginning of Bet Mishpachah, but we all worked it out somehow. And then we had our misfits because after I stepped down, we elected somebody, and then somebody went and outed him at work. And he got fired, and he got really mad at us, of course, and of course he dropped out. Then we elected a guy who I know lived in Virginia, but I can't remember what his name was.
Al Roberts, was it?
What's it?
Was it Al Roberts? Because he hosted Rosh Hashanah.
Roberts, no. I knew Alan Roberts, but it was somebody else. Alan Roberts lived over in Crystal City, Roslyn area.
Right.
Moved to Florida. I was very good friends with him.
Are you talking about Morris Umansky?
No, not Morris Umansky. I know him too. No, it was somebody else, somebody who's probably, I guess, basically long forgotten. And I don't know that any records ever were really kept or, moved around from person to person. I don't know, Jocelyn, what year did you join? I have no idea at now.
76, 77.
Mhm. There was also a woman, Ina Rodman, number of people that were Bet Mishpachah. But I'm sorry, my memory is lost at this age in my life.
Well, thank you so much for believing in us, Joel, and being so instrumental in helping us build our foundation and supporting it. So we're all very indebted to you and the founders. Thank you.
That I was lapsed for the last 30 years.
You're here now.
My heart has always been in it, and it remains. That Mishpachah is in my heart and my soul.
Bravo.
Joel, it sounds like we may have to do another one of these sessions with you. You've got a lot to tell us. I'll be in touch.
And then Jocelyn for sure.
That's right.
And then
I'd like
Stuart.
to pivot back a sec to Eva and Elka to say thank you again. Eva, we're so lucky you stumbled into us, and I'm glad that we're your DC family, and Elka the same. This is enormously interesting, and we are the results of the history that you all lived, and you can be very proud of that. And we honor and venerate you, and we're proud of you. So thank you for that. And Joel, I really will be in touch because it sounds like you've got a good story to tell as well.
Well, my last thing is stand up, fight back. And don't forget to vote.
Oh, yeah.
And when we fight, we win.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Hugs and kisses, Eva.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much,
everyone,
Joe.
so much.
Thank you. This was wonderful. Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Thank you, Eva and Elka. Nice to see you, Joel.
Thank you all. Bye, Eva. Bye, Elka.
Bye-bye.